These are some of the key functional groups that, at least I personally think you should know to prepare you for biochemistry. You'll see that these functional groups add extra features as opposed to just carbons and hydrogens, and you'll see these functional groups pop up all over the place from amino acids to your metabolic pathways. And the reason why is because having those functional groups allows for things like polarity, separation of charge, that allows for then intermolecular forces, and that allow molecules to do things like act as nucleophiles, say, and help enzymes catalyze or speed up reactions. So here's just a quick guide to some of the important functional groups. So you'll see this group, carbonyl, C double bonded to an O, you'll see that show up all over the place. And it's really special because basically what's going to happen is the oxygen is going to be more electronegative. It's going to pull the electrons away from the carbon, making the carbon partly positive, the oxygen partly negative. And so the carbon is going to be electrophilic and then vulnerable to attack. And so that's just kind of more of the chemical why you see it show up all over the place because it's this useful thing. But now let's talk about some of the names we give when we find it. So if we find a carbon on either side of the carbonyl, we call this a ketone. If it has a carbon on one side and then it's got a hydrogen on the other side, we call it an aldehyde. And you might see it abbreviated CHO. You see this a lot when you're talking about like sugars. You might also see carboxylic acids and carboxylates. So if you have a carbonyl next to an OH, so if you just had the OH, we call that a hydroxyl or an alcohol group. But if you have it next to a carbonyl, well, now we call it a carboxylic acid. Now, the words carboxylic acid and carboxylate. So when you see this ending 8, that's telling you you've got an anion, you've got something that's negatively charged. If a carboxylic acid or any acid gives up a proton, which is one definition of an acid, is it's something that gives up a proton. Once it gives up a proton, you have its conjugate base. The conjugate base of carboxylic acid are carboxylate. So you might see carboxylic acid, abbreviated COOH, and carboxylate, COO minus. Okay, what if you have a carbonyl and then an oxygen and then a carbon? So you've got this kind of sandwich situation going on. We call this the ester. Don't confuse an ester with an ether. So an ether is going to have an oxygen with carbons on either side. So it's more of a symmetrical sandwich. Whereas an ester, you're going to have a carbonyl on one side and then a hydrocarbon on the other side. Sometimes if you have something that's carbons and hydrogens and stuff, you'll see it abbreviated in R for like rest of the molecule. And so you might see an ether abbreviated ROR. Ester is similar but different from an amide. So an amide, if we see an amide bond in the context of a protein, we call it a peptide bond. But what an amide is you have this carbonyl next to a nitrogen next to a carbon. Now, don't confuse an amide and an amine. In an amine, you just have a nitrogen next to a hydrocarbon or something. But in an amide, it's directly next to a carbonyl. And then it's got a carbon on the other side. So this is an amide. We call this an acetyl group. This carbonyl next to this methyl group, we call this an acetyl group. And one of the places that you'll see an acetyl group in biochemistry is in the case of acetyl-CoA. You see the acetyl group is actually attached to this big old handle thing called CoA, coenzyme A, which is derived from vitamin B5 or pantothenate. And it's attached through a thioester linkage. And so let's talk about thioesters. Remember that we said that an ester was when we had this carbonyl next to an oxygen next to a carbon. Now, if we see an abbreviation that's sulfur something, it's thio, it's mercapto, that's indicating that we have something with sulfur in it. So a thioester, sometimes called a sulfide, is the sulfur analog of an ester. And remember, ester, we have our carbonyl next to an oxygen next to a carbon. And so a thioester or a sulfide is going to have a carbonyl next to a sulfur next to a carbon. Remember, we didn't want to confuse our esters and our ethers. Well, we don't want to confuse our thioesters with our thioethers. So a thioether, such as you might see in methionine, the amino acid, has a sulfur sandwiched between two carbons, but the carbons are just attached to hydrogens and stuff, not to a carbonyl. And then with the thioester, you specifically have this carbonyl next to it. So we said that the 8 ending was going to indicate that we have a negative charge, we have an anion. And we saw it before when we were talking about carboxylic acid and carboxylate. Well, the same thing occurs when we have a hydroxyl group and we have a hydroxylate, or we have a thiol group, which is the sulfur equivalent of a hydroxyl group, and it's sometimes called a sulfhydryl group. When they deprotonate, then we get 8 abbreviations too. And so we have a sulfhydryl group or a thiol, and another name for it, it's got a lot of names, is a mercaptan. And so that is going to then deprotonate, it'll act as an acid, deprotonate, and you get a thiolate. A hydroxyl group or an alcohol, it can deprotonate, and that'll give you a hydroxylate. And then remember carboxylic acid and carboxylate. A couple more. So we said that the carbonyl was cool. It's got this carbon double bound to an oxygen, and we saw that we could stick it next to different things. Well, if we stick it next to another hydrocarbon, so like an alkyl group, so here it's just depicted as an R, and then we call this an acyl group. So this is a generic acyl group, and we already saw an acyl group, which is one form of an acyl group, which is kind of like the shortest form. We have the shortest R chain we could have. You'll also see in biochemistry like acyl carrier proteins, which come up with lipid metabolism, so various acyls. And one of the acyls that you'll see commonly is an acyl phosphate. And in an acyl phosphate, you have a phosphate group attached to a carbonyl. So remember that this would be kind of like an acyl, and so this would be an acyl phosphate. And that's going to be a very reactive type of bond. A couple things not so reactive are when we have these aromatic rings. It's kind of confusing because if you just have a benzene ring attached to something, we call it a phenyl group. But if it's a benzene and then it's got a carbon and then it's something else, then we call it a benzyl group. So the way that I kind of remember this is phenylalanine. And so the amino acid phenylalanine, you've got a phenyl group that is attached to alanine. So alanine, the amino acid alanine, it already has this carbon here. So we can call this group a phenyl group. And if we were to count back to this carbon, now this would be a benzyl group. So it's a little confusing. The important thing really for biochemistry is to know that those are both aromatic. So there you go. There are some important functional groups that I personally think you should know. And hopefully these will help you recognize them when they come up in various places in biochemistry and be able to realize what sorts of things those molecules might be able to do thanks to the presence of those functional groups.